The Cambodian jungle is not a place meant for the careless. It breathes with a life of its own, dense and suffocating, ancient and unforgiving. Beneath the heavy green canopy, light struggles to reach the forest floor. Vines hang like nooses from twisted trees. The air is thick, clinging to the skin, pressing into the lungs. The sounds are endless. The drone of insects, the shrill cries of hidden birds, the rustling of unseen creatures just out of sight. It is a place that swallows men whole and rarely gives them back. In the summer of 2014, 5 young travelers, Lena, Mark, Sophie, Daniel, and Eric, set foot in that jungle. They were bound by friendship and driven by a hunger for adventure, the kind of people who sought out the places that frightened others. To them, the danger wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. They had crossed borders together, moved from cities to rural landscapes, shared nights on trains and floors of hostels. But Cambodia would be different. Cambodia would change everything. They arrived in Phnom Penh in June. Like thousands of other backpackers, they blended easily into the transient chaos of the capital. Their phones and cameras captured them on buzzing scooters, weaving through traffic, wandering temple ruins, and drinking in neon-lit bars. To anyone watching, they were untouchable, carefree and alive. 5 faces glowing with the kind of joy that only comes when you believe the world belongs to you. But somewhere along the way, joy turned into restlessness. From Phnom Penh they drifted north, finding themselves in Kratie, a quiet town perched on the Mekong River. This was where their plans began to shift. They told people at their guest house they weren't here to follow the guidebooks. They weren't here to take the easy trails or join a package tour. They wanted something raw. They wanted the jungle, not the version mapped for tourists, but the real one, the one locals avoided, the one that felt forbidden. The warnings came immediately. The guesthouse owner told them about snakes that could kill in minutes, about sudden flash floods, about the old landmines still buried beneath the soil since the Khmer Rouge. Even the guides admitted the deep jungle was treacherous. People had disappeared before. Some were never seen again. But the 5 friends dismissed the warnings. They had traveled before, survived hardships before. They believed they could handle it. They wanted a story to tell, and they would get one. On the morning of June 21, 2014, the group left their guest house just after sunrise. They carried light packs, tents, sleeping bags, a few days of food, cameras, notebooks. Not nearly enough for the weeks they would vanish. Witnesses remembered their laughter, their energy, their eagerness to disappear into the trees. They promised to be back in 3 days. They were never seen together again. At first, no one panicked. Travelers are unpredictable. Plans change. Maybe they stayed longer. Maybe they'd taken another path. Maybe they met other backpackers and lost track of time. But after a week without messages or social media posts, their families began to worry. Calls went unanswered. Emails stayed silent. Photos stopped. For 5 people who documented everything, the sudden silence was more than strange. It was alarming. By early July, authorities were alerted. Search teams mobilized. Helicopters swept across the jungle canopy. Police, soldiers, and local volunteers hacked through dense undergrowth with machetes, fighting heat, insects, exhaustion. They searched for footprints, discarded clothing, a campfire, anything that could point to where the 5 had gone. But the jungle gave back nothing. No broken branches, no scraps of fabric, no signs of struggle. It was as if the 5 had stepped into another world, swallowed completely. For their families, the waiting was torment. Desperate calls across borders, press conferences, pleas for answers. But as weeks bled into months, the case stalled. The Cambodian jungle had consumed them, just as it had consumed others before. Rumors began to spread. Some said the group had been kidnapped, trafficked, or attacked. Others whispered about curses and spirits, about the jungle itself taking them as punishment for trespassing. For 6 long years, the mystery remained unsolved. The friends' faces faded from the headlines. Their families carried on with no closure, trapped between grief and hope. And then, in 2020, everything changed. A man appeared at the edge of the jungle. He was barefoot, clothes torn to rags, his body wasted and scarred. His skin was sunburnt and covered in insect bites. His beard was long, his hair matted. He could barely stand, but he was alive. It was Eric, the only one of the 5 who had survived. When rescuers brought him in, they described his eyes as haunted. He flinched at sudden sounds. His speech was broken, sometimes coherent, sometimes a jumble of whispers. At night, nurses heard him muttering, fragments of sentences, pieces of nightmares. The trees are alive. We shouldn't have gone. They're still there. At first, investigators thought he had gone mad from years of isolation, hallucinations born from trauma. But as days passed, Eric began to speak more clearly. And what he revealed was worse than anyone imagined. He insisted the group hadn't simply gotten lost. They hadn't simply died of hunger or disease. Something else had happened. Something darker. He said the jungle had taken them. Not with snakes, not with floods, not with landmines. With something else. Something he refused to name at first, as if even speaking of it would bring it back. And though his story shifted, though his words sometimes contradicted themselves, there was one constant: his terror. The way his voice shook, the way his hands trembled when he described the nights. His body was alive, but something in him had died. And the secret he carried about what had happened to his friends would torment everyone who heard it. 5 had gone in. Only 1 had returned. And the truth of what happened in that jungle remained locked inside the mind of a man who seemed more ghost than human. To understand what happened in the Cambodian jungle, investigators began retracing the steps of the 5 friends. What they pieced together was not only the story of their journey, but also the slow unraveling of their fate. The group, Lena, Mark, Sophie, Daniel, and Eric, left Craty on June 21, 2014. Their destination was the jungle region east of Stung Treng Province, a vast area bordering Laos, scarred by years of conflict and rarely traveled by outsiders. They hired a local driver to take them as far as the dirt roads would allow. Witnesses remembered the driver's unease. He later said he had begged them not to go deeper. No road there, he warned. Only forest, only danger, but they insisted. Adventure was the point. They wanted isolation, mystery, challenge. They wanted to push themselves. Against his better judgment, the driver dropped them at a clearing where the road simply ended and trees began. That was the last time all 5 were seen alive. The first day of their trek appeared uneventful, according to notes recovered later. In Sophie's journal, spirits were high. They joked about the heat, about leeches clinging to their legs, about the way the forest seemed endless. They moved as if the jungle were theirs to conquer. But as the sun set, the tone shifted. The Cambodian jungle at night is not silence. It is deafening. Insects scream, frogs croak in strange rhythms, and unseen creatures shuffle in the dark. The friends pitched their tents, lit a small fire, and huddled close. Sophie's notes mentioned strange calls in the distance, not quite animal, not quite human. She wrote, "I don't know what it was. Like someone screaming, but muffled. Mark says it's just monkeys. Still, it doesn't sound like monkeys." On their second day, progress slowed. The jungle grew denser, paths twisted back on themselves, and rivers blocked their way. Food supplies were limited, and the humidity drained their strength. Sophie's journal became less playful, more uneasy. She wrote, "The forest feels wrong. The air is heavy, pressing down on us. It feels like being watched." By the third day, tensions began to show. Daniel, the most practical of the group, wanted to turn back. He argued that they didn't have enough food, that the map they had, bought in Phnom Penh, was crude, almost useless. Lena dismissed his worries, insisting they were close to reaching an abandoned temple ruin they had read about online, a temple that few tourists had ever seen. The others sided with Lena. Daniel gave in, but his frustration was noted in Sophie's journal. "Dan is angry. He says we're being stupid. He says the jungle isn't a game, but none of us want to quit yet." That night, the strange cries returned, this time closer. Sophie didn't write much about it, only one unsettling line. Mark didn't sleep. He sat awake, staring into the dark, clutching a stick like a weapon. By the 5th day, the group was exhausted. Their food was running out. Their water filtration pump had clogged with mud, leaving them to boil river water over small fires. Sophie's last entries grew scattered, her handwriting uneven. Words hurried. She described hearing whispers in the night. Not animal sounds, not the cries from before, but actual whispers, as though people were moving around their camp, speaking in low voices just out of reach. I woke up and thought I saw someone, standing between the trees, just watching. When I blinked, they were gone. It was around this time that things began to collapse. Witnesses later claimed that villagers near the forest edge saw foreigners wandering disoriented, clothes torn, faces pale. The descriptions fit the group, but by the time searchers followed those reports, there was no trace. The next piece of evidence surfaced years later when Eric was found. Among the rags he wore was a scrap of fabric, part of Sophie's journal cover. Pages had been torn out, smeared with dirt and blood. Investigators studied what remained. The last legible entry was dated June 28th. "We are not alone. Something is following us. At night it circles closer. During the day we hear it moving when we stop. Mark says it's just paranoia, but I saw footprints, not ours. Not animals, human. Bare feet, many of them." From that moment, the story shifted from survival to something else. Something stalking them. Something unseen. Eric later confirmed fragments of this in his broken recollections. He said they had started hearing chanting at night. He described torches glimpsed deep in the trees. He remembered Lena screaming when she found strange symbols carved into a tree near their camp, symbols that none of them could explain. What began as a trek for adventure was turning into a nightmare. None of them understood. The jungle was no longer just a wilderness. It had become a labyrinth. And inside that labyrinth, something was waiting, watching, closing in. By the 7th day in the Cambodian jungle, the 5 friends were running on fumes. Their food supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing, and the last of their clean water had been rationed into tiny sips. The air was so thick with humidity that every breath felt like inhaling steam. Mosquitoes swarmed their exposed skin, leaving welts that turned red and swollen. But the physical exhaustion was only part of the story. The real terror was psychological. Sophie's final journal pages, what little of them remained unspoiled, paint a portrait of unraveling minds. She described arguments breaking out between Lena and Daniel, voices raised, accusations thrown. Daniel accused Lena of pushing them too far, chasing after a ruin that might not even exist. Lena snapped back, insisting that turning back now would mean all their suffering had been for nothing. Eric and Mark tried to intervene, but by then, unity had fractured. One entry simply read, "It feels like something wants us to turn against each other. I don't know if it's the jungle, or if it's in us." On the 8th night, the whispers came again, not distant this time, but close, circling their camp. Eric, years later, would say he thought it was men speaking in a language he didn't understand, deep, rhythmic, almost like a chant. He said the voices moved around them, encircling their tiny fire. Yet when Mark rushed into the trees with his flashlight, there was nothing there. Just vines, mist, and shadows. That was the night. Sophie vanished. Eric remembered waking to Lena's screams. Sophie's tent was empty. Her boots, her backpack, even her clothes were still there. The only sign was a trail of dragged footprints leading into the trees. Bare feet, pressed deep into the mud, alongside Sophie's lighter, panicked tracks, as if someone or something had pulled her from the camp in the middle of the night. They searched for hours, shouting her name, but the jungle gave nothing back. The air was silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just silence so thick it felt unnatural. By dawn, Mark was muttering to himself. He claimed he had seen a figure in the darkness, standing just beyond the firelight. A tall figure, motionless, watching. Lena tried to calm him, but Mark became frantic. It wasn't human, he kept saying. It wasn't human. With Sophie gone, the group spiraled further. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst blurred their vision, and paranoia cracked their bonds. Daniel announced he was leaving, that he would follow the river until it let him out. He said staying was suicide. The others begged him not to split up, but he wouldn't listen. He stormed off with what little water he had left. That was the last time any of them saw Daniel alive. Lena, Mark, and Eric pressed on together, but Eric later admitted he barely remembered how those days unfolded. Time seemed to lose meaning. He recalled walking for hours and finding themselves in the same place they started. He recalled coming across trees carved with symbols, circles within circles, jagged marks, and lines that seemed to drip downward. None of them could explain it, yet the carvings looked fresh, as though someone had made them only hours earlier. And then came the temple. It wasn't on any map they had, not even in the vague online articles Lena had read before their trip. But one afternoon, through a break in the trees, the group stumbled upon crumbling stone steps leading upward. Vines had overtaken much of it, but the shape was clear, the remains of an ancient Khmer structure. Reliefs of faces, worn by centuries of rain, stared back at them from the stone. Their mouths were open, frozen in expressions that almost looked like screams. Inside the ruins, they found offerings, animal bones arranged neatly in circles, feathers tied with twine, and ashes from recent fires. Someone had been there, and not long ago. That night, Lena swore she saw torchlight moving among the ruins, figures pacing silently, carrying flames that flickered in the dark. Eric remembered, Mark's hands shaking, gripping a rock as if preparing to fight. And then, just before dawn, they heard it again, the chanting. Low, rhythmic, unrelenting. By the 9th day, Mark was gone too. Eric couldn't explain how it happened. One moment Mark was with them, muttering about faces in the trees, and the next he had vanished. Lena and Eric searched frantically, but found no trace except Mark's pack, lying against a stone wall. Lena broke down, sobbing, her voice echoing against the ruins. Eric tried to hold her together, but he confessed later that by then he felt himself breaking too. His memories blur after that, flashes of movement in the dark, Lena screaming, the ground wet with blood, and then nothing. When rescuers found Eric years later, wandering half-starved near a village, his body was scarred with burns and cuts, his mind was fractured. He could barely remember his own name, let alone the sequence of events. What he did say chilled. Investigators. They didn't die in the jungle, they were taken. They were offered. Those words would haunt everyone who worked the case, because they suggested something far worse than an accident or starvation. They suggested ritual, and the question no one could answer was, offered to what? When Eric emerged from the jungle years later, he was barely recognizable as the man who had once boarded a plane with his 4 friends. His skin was gaunt, his hair matted, his body covered in cuts and strange burns. He stumbled barefoot into a small Cambodian village on the edge of Mondulkiri province, collapsing at the entrance of a dirt road. The villagers thought he was a spirit at first, a ghost wandering back from the jungle. His eyes were hollow, and his words came out broken, as if language itself had abandoned him. He was rushed to a local clinic where doctors tried to stabilize him. He had infections. In his wounds, severe malnutrition, and what they described as extreme psychological trauma. But when he was finally coherent enough to speak, his story terrified even the hardened investigators who had worked years of disappearances in Southeast Asia. He whispered about the chanting, about faces painted in ash, about rituals in the ruins that stretched deep into the jungle. And then he said something that sent chills through the room. They took them. They didn't die. They were given. The authorities were cautious. Cambodia had seen its fair share of ghost stories, rumors of forest spirits and dark cults hiding in the jungle. Most were dismissed as folklore, but Eric's body told a different story. His scars weren't just scratches from vines. They were deliberate, burn marks shaped into circles and jagged lines, etched into his skin like symbols. Forensic doctors photographed every inch. They counted at least 32 distinct carvings and burns across his chest, arms, and back. Some matched the strange symbols found carved into trees near where search parties had once passed years earlier. And yet, Eric couldn't explain how he had survived. Investigators pressed him. Where were Lena, Sophie, Daniel, and Mark? How had he gotten out? Why had he wandered for years in silence? His answers were fragmented. They took her in the night. The river ran red. We went inside, but the walls closed. And most disturbing of all, they wanted me to stay. But they let me go. They wanted me to tell it. Word of Eric's reappearance spread quickly. Families of the missing friends, who had spent years in limbo, caught between grief and uncertainty, were suddenly thrust back into a nightmare. Sophie's parents flew immediately to Cambodia. Mark's brother gave interviews, saying he had never believed they would all vanish without a trace. But the families weren't prepared for what investigators would show them. In a folder were Eric's photographs, the symbols carved into his flesh, distorted circles, interlocking triangles, crude faces with wide mouths. To the families they were just horrifying images, but to investigators they hinted at something else: organization. Someone had done this with intention. Someone out there was practicing ritual. The search for answers led deeper into the jungle than ever before. Guided by Eric's broken recollections, Cambodian authorities and hired guides ventured toward the ruins he described. What they found was almost beyond belief. The temple was real, hidden beneath centuries of vines and soil. Its crumbling walls rose like jagged teeth from the earth. Inside, the evidence was undeniable. Animal bones arranged in circles, charred remains of fires, and on the walls, the same symbols carved into Eric's body. But there was something else: a shallow pit, blackened with ash, filled with fragments of human bone. Forensic analysis later confirmed what everyone feared: at least 2 different individuals. The remains, too degraded to identify, but consistent with being several years old. The investigators returned shaken. They knew what the jungle had been hiding, but they didn't know who or what was responsible. Eric's account only grew darker. In one interview, recorded by a foreign journalist who had traveled to Cambodia to follow the story, Eric said, "They watched us. At first, I thought they were men, but they weren't. Their faces, they didn't move right. When they smiled, it wasn't human." The journalist pressed him, asking if he meant masks, disguises. Eric shook his head violently. "No, not masks, not masks." It was clear Eric was spiraling between moments of clarity and terror. Sometimes, he would describe ordinary villagers leading them away. Other times, he would insist the jungle itself had turned against them. Trees with eyes, rivers that whispered. His testimony was unreliable, but there were fragments, small truths hidden in the madness, that investigators couldn't ignore. The families wanted answers. The Cambodian government, already wary of foreign attention, wanted silence. And the locals, they avoided the topic altogether. When asked about the ruins, they shook their heads, muttered prayers, and said only one word: Nik Tai. In Cambodian folklore, Nik Ta are guardian spirits, tied to the land. They can protect, but they can also punish. Some villagers whispered that the friends had trespassed where they should not have, disturbing something ancient and unforgiving. But others insisted this wasn't folklore at all. It was something worse. Evidence suggested that a cult, small, hidden, generational, might still be active in those jungles, offering sacrifices in exchange for protection, power, or something darker. And Eric, the only one left alive, might not have escaped them at all. Some investigators began to wonder, had he been spared or chosen? The world wanted answers. Newspapers in Europe splashed headlines about the Cambodian jungle mystery. Families begged governments to intervene. And Eric, the lone survivor, sat trembling under fluorescent hospital lights, replaying horrors no one could fully understand. But in Cambodia, answers were not so simple. The jungle was a labyrinth, vast and merciless, and the ruins Eric had spoken of were hidden in places maps refused to mark. So investigators went back in, this time with more men, more equipment, and a determination to peel back the jungle's secrets. The path was suffocating. Humidity thickened like a living thing clinging to their skin. Insects screamed from the canopy. Each step deeper felt like a step further away from civilization, from safety. Guides moved cautiously, muttering warnings in Khmer, refusing to walk at night. "The jungle belongs to them after dark," one whispered. 2 days in, the team reached the site Eric had described. The ruins. By daylight, the temple seemed ordinary, another forgotten relic swallowed by the jungle. But as the team descended into the broken archways, they saw it, ritual markings smeared across stone, layers of ash where fires had burned, and bones, too many bones. Some belonged to animals: wild boar, birds, monkeys, but others did not. A forensic specialist lifted a fractured human jaw from the dirt, its teeth stained with soil. Another uncovered femur fragments, brittle and old. The air in the chamber grew colder, though the heat outside pressed like fire. On the far wall, investigators found a mural, faded but unmistakable. 5 human figures standing before a towering shape. The shape was not a man, not an animal. It was something between long limbs, hollow eyes, a face stretched unnaturally wide. Eric's rambling words echoed in their minds. When they smiled, it wasn't human. Suddenly, the story of 5 young tourists stumbling into the wrong part of the jungle didn't feel so simple. The more they searched, the more the sight revealed. Buried in a pit near the center, they uncovered a rusted camera. Miraculously, its memory card survived. Though water damaged, some images were recoverable. What the files revealed was devastating. Photos of Lena and Sophie, smiling in the jungle, backpack strapped tight. Daniel pointing toward an enormous strangler fig. Mark adjusting his GPS. They looked alive, adventurous, full of energy. But the last photographs chilled investigators. The friends standing at the temple entrance, shadows falling unnaturally across the stone. Another photo, torches burning in the distance, dozens of them, surrounding the ruins. And then, a final image. A blurred, distorted shot of figures with white-painted faces watching from the tree line. It was the last time the 5 were seen together. The families were shown the photographs in private. Some collapsed in grief. Others demanded to know why governments had failed them, why no one had acted sooner. But one reaction stood out. Sophie's mother, tears streaking her face, whispered, "That's not them. They're not smiling. That's not their smile." Her words sent shivers through the room. When investigators studied the images again, they noticed it. Something wrong with the expressions. The smiles looked stiff, unnatural, as if forced. And then came the discovery that changed everything. While analyzing the mural and the carvings, inside the ruins, an anthropologist identified symbols linked not only to Cambodian folklore, but to practices stretching back to the Khmer Rouge era. It suggested the existence of a hidden sect, one that had survived underground for decades, carrying out rituals away from the eyes of the modern world. A cult, hidden in the jungle. The theory gained momentum. Eric's scars weren't random. They were initiation marks. His release wasn't mercy, it was intentional. The cult had chosen him to return, to spread the fear. But investigators also noticed something else about Eric. His behavior changed after visits to the ruins. He grew restless, muttered in languages he claimed not to know. Once, during questioning, he grabbed an officer's wrist with unnatural strength and hissed, "You shouldn't have gone inside." It was as if the jungle had never truly let him go. The Cambodian government tried to suppress the findings. Foreign journalists were pushed out, files were sealed, and officials claimed the bones and artifacts were inconclusive. But those who had seen the evidence knew the truth ran deeper. What had happened to Lena, Sophie, Daniel, and Mark? Were they sacrificed to something ancient? Were they still alive when the photos were taken, or forced into something worse? And the question that terrified everyone the most, if Eric was truly released by the cult, then why him? And what secret was he still holding back? Hospitals are meant to heal. White walls, sterile air, nurses moving like clockwork. But around Eric, nothing felt normal anymore. His eyes darted at shadows no one else could see. He spoke less, ate less, and often sat whispering to himself, repeating strange words in a language the translators said was ancient Khmer, centuries old. The official narrative was shaky. 5 tourists went missing, 1 survived. But in private interviews, Eric revealed more, and each revelation was worse than the last. One evening, a young doctor entered his room, carrying Eric's file. She found him sitting upright, motionless, staring at the corner of the ceiling. His lips moved soundlessly. She asked him what he was saying. He turned to her, and for the first time, his voice was steady. "They didn't die in the jungle," he said. "They changed." The doctor pressed him to explain. His hands trembled violently. It wasn't hunger that killed them. It wasn't thirst. It was the ritual. They made us part of it. Eric described a night of fire and chanting, torches circling the ruins. Dozens of figures and white-painted faces surrounded them. He and his friends were dragged to the center, forced to kneel. He remembered Sophie screaming. He remembered Daniel, struggling until his body gave out, but then his voice broke. Lena, she didn't scream. She accepted it, like she knew. He claimed the cult performed something older than even the ruins. They were made to drink from a blackened bowl. The taste was metallic, foul, thick like blood. After that, he said, they weren't my friends anymore. Investigators leaned forward, horrified. What do you mean? His eyes went wide. Their faces, their eyes. They smiled at me, but it wasn't them. According to Eric, the 4 weren't killed. They were taken. Their bodies were used. Their voices changed. He swore they were alive, but no longer human. And then he whispered the words that froze the room. They let me go because I belong to them now. I'm the messenger. The more he spoke, the more impossible it became to dismiss his story as trauma or delusion. Because days later, Cambodian locals reported sightings near the jungle ruins. 4 pale figures moving silently at night, always together, always watching. Farmers swore they saw one of them smile with a mouth that seemed too wide, teeth too many. Authorities dismissed it as rumor, but the whispers spread. Villagers began refusing to go near the ruins. Whole communities relocated deeper into the jungle, abandoning fertile land. They called the ruins Chao Pem, the cursed place. And then came the last piece of evidence, weeks after Eric's death. Yes, death, because his body was found one morning in the hospital, lying in bed with his face twisted in an expression no one could describe. Staff discovered a notebook hidden under his mattress. Its pages were frantic, words scribbled in English and Khmer. Some passages were unreadable, but others were clear. He wrote, "They are still there. They don't need food. They don't need light. They wait. They want me to tell the world. Once you see them, it's already too late." The final page was smeared with something dark, like dried blood. And on it, a single sentence. The jungle never lets you leave. Today, the Cambodian government denies everything. They say the ruins hold no cult, no threat, no survivors. The families of Lena, Sophie, Daniel, and Mark never received bodies to bury. Just silence. But travelers still vanish near that stretch of jungle. And locals still whisper about pale figures, waiting. So what happened to the 5 friends? Were they victims of a brutal cult? Did they stumble into something older, something supernatural? Or was Eric's terrifying story the ramblings of a broken mind? We may never know, but if you ever find yourself in Cambodia, deep in the jungle where the ruins lie hidden, and you hear laughter in the trees, turn back, because sometimes survival is not a blessing. Sometimes it's the curse. And remember, the jungle never lets you leave. If you found this story chilling, disturbing, and unforgettable, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another mystery. We bring you the darkest, most haunting true crime stories the world has to offer. Stay curious, stay safe, and stay away from the places the world was never meant to see.